It's only 2 months since we marked the 20th anniversary of the Bali bombings. 202 lives were lost, including 88 Australians. One of the bomb makers, Umar Patek, walked free from jail today after serving less than 12 years behind bars. Here's the latest from 7 News.
After the attack, he fled the country and remained on the run for around a decade, becoming one of the most well-known wanted terror suspects in Asia. He was eventually captured and sentenced to more than 20 years behind bars. But while in prison, Indonesian authorities granted him a number of reductions to his sentence. Plus, they say he went through a coaching program to be de-radicalised. That, plus good behaviour, has given him this early parole, despite the Australian government making a number of diplomatic representations to Indonesian authorities opposing that early release.
Let's bring in Professor Tim Lindsey, Director of the Centre for Indonesian Law, Islam and Society at the Melbourne Law School. Good to talk to you again, Tim. I want to hear about,
Thanks, Chris,
from you how Indonesia would see this parole, but I think while it's sickening to see this man walk free for Australians, we always have to remind ourselves that Indonesia did execute bombers, Bali bombers, and indeed one of the masterminds, Bali, I believe, is still imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, isn't he?
Yes, he's one of their forever inmates, it looks like. Look, Chris, I think this has to be understood as part of a wider strategy by the Indonesian government in dealing with Islamist militant groups, such as the one that carried out this attack in Bali, Jemaah Islamiyah, which is now pretty much been destroyed completely in operational terms. And it's a carrot and stick approach. So the stick is their famous, maybe notorious Densus 88, a battalion, anti-terror battalion that often seems to throw away the rule books and is engaged in shootouts and attacks that have resulted in the killing of many Islamist militants and suspects, and of course, bringing others to justice, and we've had trials and we've had executions. That's the stick, and it's a pretty fierce stick. The carrot is, however, that if these militants can show that they've de-radicalised or at least are willing to comply with the Indonesian state's expectations and abandon their commitment to terrorism, then they will receive benefits. And I think Patek has been identified by the authorities in Indonesia as a sort of poster boy for their de-radicalisation carrot, if you like, because he, unlike the bombers who were executed, claimed to show remorse during his trial. He was spared the death sentence. He received this sentence of about 20 years, and then he received a whole series of remissions. Now, these remissions are standard remissions. Most prisoners in Indonesia benefit from them. And once he's served 2/3 of the sentence reduced by those remissions, he's eligible for parole. And we need to remember that that applies to almost all prisoners who have good behaviour. It's how Schapelle Corby was able to win a parole. Other Australian prisoners have benefited from these remissions as well. So parole, Patek becomes eligible, and the Indonesian government gives him this early release on parole, subject to a monitoring program, as a way of signalling to other militants that you can choose between Densus 88 or de-radicalisation and potential early freedom.
So it's reassuring to know there will be ongoing monitoring. We've seen vision along the way of Patek while he's in jail, walking around with the prison governor, talking and joking. Explain to us why this is seen as acceptable in Indonesia when obviously it makes our stomachs churn.
Well, I don't know that I can explain to you why it is acceptable, but it's quite common. It's quite common for governors to interact with prisoners. Prisoners who are seen to be of good behaviour often enjoy this sort of sense of camaraderie. It's not unusual for videos to be released along these lines. Right. Australian prisoners have had the same sort of relationships with prison authorities, and when Australian prisoners have applied for remissions and parole, there's often been videos of exactly the same sort released.
All right, now just briefly, we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to talk about these new changes to social laws in Indonesia. There's been a lot of focus on banning sex outside marriage and how that might be a proxy to clamp down on gay relationships. But there are other changes about criticism of the president and the like that could stifle freedom of speech. Are you concerned that Indonesia is going to a more fundamentalist legal framework?
Look, I think it is of concern that this new criminal code that's been introduced restricts freedoms of expression, it restricts press freedoms, it restricts the ability to protest, it makes people liable to be jailed for criticising, insulting the president, even if what they say is true. These are not good things. These are a part of a wider democratic regression that's going on in Indonesia, and it should be a concern. But I don't think it's driven by Islamist militants. It's more likely driven by the fact that Indonesia is heading into an election campaign in February 2024. The whole legislature and a new president will be elected, and this will determine the political landscape of Indonesia for 5 years, maybe 10 if the new president gets a second term. So politicians are all positioning themselves now for their campaigns over the next year. And of course, it really plays well for many of those politicians to be displaying their moral credentials to voters. And of course, the government is quite happy to have new laws that allow it to crack down on criticism. I think that's really what's driving this.
Yeah, that's a worry. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate your time.